This is the first lecture of week 7, and we're going to be looking at the book of Exodus starting at this point. And again, you can listen to this as an audio if you want, and please read Exodus 1 to 2 before you listen to this lecture. So, as I stated in the lecture last time, which was a week ago before break, the story of Joseph sets up for the following story about Moses in the book of Exodus. And it does so by placing the Israelites kind of far away from the promised land of Canaan. They are now in Egypt instead. And as I stated before, going away from the promised land really means symbolically that the Israelites are going far away from God's promise to Abraham. Okay. So going away from the promised land is going away from the promise Abraham had promised. Going towards the promised land means, of course, going towards the promise. Okay. And so therefore, by putting the Israelites away from the promised land in the story of Joseph, right, because all the Israelites moved down there to escape the famine, this really sets up the context for now what will happen in the next book, in the book of Exodus, where the Israelites will return to the promised land and therefore return to fulfilling the promise that God makes to their forefather Abraham. Okay. Indeed, Joseph, with his magical abilities, we saw, foretells that the journey that the Israelites are about to take or will take after he dies, right? So Genesis closes with Joseph foretelling the return of the Israelites back to the promised land. And this is found in Genesis 50, verses 24 and 26. And really, this is how the book of Exodus ends, right? Sort of looking forward. We're told in those verses, then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you out of the land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, when God comes to you, you shall carry out my bones from there. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. So this is how Genesis ends, right? With these last words spoken by Joseph, who is, again, a magician, able to kind of quasi-foretell the future, right? And of course, this is all kind of set up, right? Leans you into the next book of Exodus, which begins with the birth of the Israelite hero who will indeed lead the Israelites now out of Egypt. Okay, and interestingly enough, Moses, who is the one that we've chosen to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, will himself be able to do so after engaging in a kind of battle of the magicians, okay, as we'll see. Okay, so we are now moving to Exodus, which is, again, still part of the Pentateuch or the Torah. Okay, one of the things to remember that came up is that, remember that JEPD, the documentary hypothesis, really only pertains to the Pentateuch. It doesn't go beyond that. Okay. Indeed, as I'll talk about probably in next week, a slightly different kind of source material is hypothesized for the books that come afterwards. Okay. Now, when Genesis ended, we were told that Joseph he had this plan whereby the royal court hoarded grain and sold it back to the Egyptians, right, during the famine, that this led to the enslavement and indeed oppression of the Egyptians, okay? And when the book of Exodus begins, the Egyptians seem to have righted this wrong. Remember, there's a kind of circular, kind of comeuppance kind of aspect to the biblical text, right? So the Egyptians seem to have righted this wrong. How? By now enslaving the Israelites, that is a group related to Joseph who helped to enslave the Egyptians in the first place, right? So again, notice the kind of circularity, okay? And of course, this sets up for the story in Exodus where now the enslavement of the Israelites will be righted, okay? And indeed, this is how the book of Exodus begins. So this is Exodus chapter 1, verse 6, okay, and following. Then Joseph died and all his brothers and the whole generation, but the Israelites were fruitful and prolific, and they multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we are. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies, fight against us, and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built the supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. And the Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. So we are told that the Israelites, who are this immigrant population in Egypt, grow numerous, right? And again, this is part of the fulfillment of the promises of God to Abraham. So numerous, in fact, that they alarm Pharaoh, who attempt to repress the population by enslaving them or giving them hard work. Okay, and it's eerie how sometimes how modern the biblical text is, right? This idea that an immigrant population is overproducing and alarming or overwhelming the threat of the true inhabitants of the land. Of course, this is still found today, repeated in anti-immigrant sentiment. So again, the biblical text, very modern at points. Okay, when forced labor fails to curb the population, Pharaoh takes harsher measures. Namely, he hires, we are told, and I would encourage you to read the text. I cannot summarize as well as what the text is saying. Namely, Pharaoh hires 2 midwives named Shiphrah and Puah to kill all the male Israelite babies, but not the girl babies, okay? But we are told that Shiphrah and Puah refuse to do so, okay? And for this, they are rewarded by God with for sort of, lots of children with overwhelming fertility. And so Pharaoh decides to take harsher measures, i.e. famously decides to throw all the boy babies into the Nile. Okay, so why are the boy babies targeted? Okay, well, as the text states, boys can grow up and fight and mount an insurrection, or, as Pharaoh says, join their enemies. Okay, there is also this underlying assumption that females are kind of blank slates here. They lack an identity or ethnicity of their own, and hence, these women, it's never quite clear how Israelite women are. Remember, we kind of encounter this with circumcision, okay? Rather, there seems to be some assumption here that the women are not Israelites, okay, per se, but almost like blank vessels who, if they, have children with Egyptian men, produce Egyptian children, okay, especially Egyptian men, okay? Mythically speaking, we've seen this idea of the population being too numerous, so numerous that the gods or leaders decide to kill off or limit the population somehow dramatically or drastically. We've seen this before with the story of the flood, okay, where some kind of population intermixing or something was hinted at as possibly the reason for the flood, and of course in the Mesopotamian myth of Atrahasis, okay, or Gilgamesh, where again the gods grow tired of the noise that the humans are making, okay, and the fact that we've seen this theme before in other myths, again hints that the story about Moses is similar to those other stories, okay, in that they feature the same motif, right, and remember what Atrahasis and the Noah myth was about, right? These were kind of origin myths, and the shared similarity between all these stories again hints that the Moses story is also a new origin myth. Okay, this time a story about the origins of the people of Israel, not necessarily the story of the family of Israel, right? So that's the family of Israel, really you find that in the patriarchal narratives. Now moving into Exodus, there's a kind of different vision of Israel, okay? There are other similarities between Atrahasis, the Noah myth, and of course the Moses story here. Like the flood story, we are told that the Moses story, like these other stories, the Moses story also sets up a theological conflict or a kind of conflict by telling you that Pharaoh, who really resembles and was envisioned as a kind of god, okay, decides to kill people, or in this case, the children, particular children of a particular group. And in so doing, again, Pharaoh is imagined as a type of deity, a kind of false deity, and thereby set up the contest between God or Yahweh, the true deity, versus Pharaoh, the false deity. Okay, as they kind of duke it out to see who is the true God and therefore the true God of the Israelites. Okay, who is the God in charge of the fertility, regeneration, and life of this people? Is it Pharaoh or is it Yahweh? Okay, so this is the main kind of setup of the contest that will emerge in the kind of early parts of Exodus. Okay, in the midst of this terror by a destructive god Pharaoh, the story switches to focus on a very particular family in Exodus 2. Okay, so this is 2:1. Chapter 2, verse 1. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got up a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. And she put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. And his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Okay, so a couple of things to note about this well-known introduction to Moses, right? The first is that in Exodus 2, right, in this part that I just read, Moses is introduced as a special holy, priestly, royal figure, okay, who is put under threat initially, but is saved or preserved by a deity in order to become a ruler or leader. Okay, probably like a religious leader, okay, as well. Notice that Moses' mom and his unnamed dad, okay, are both said to be Levites, and of course, Levites, or the tribe of Levi, is the tribe from which all the priests of Israel will emerge. Okay, so there's a, in the biblical text, I mean, politics and religion are deeply intertwined, okay? Coogan notes in his book that this pattern of a young, divinely chosen favored ruler who doesn't really know their true identity, but yet is threatened, but saved by their God in order to for their royal identity to be revealed and for them to be kind of made ruler of their people. We find this structure in other Near Eastern and Mediterranean myths and traditions. Okay, so you see this with Hercules, Oedipus, and Sargon. Indeed, Coogan cites, gives you a little snippet of this exact same pattern, now as applied to Sargon, who becomes the king of Assyria, which is called Akkad. Okay, so I'm just quoting from Coogan. If you need to see this, you can refer back to this book. So this is the myth of Sargon. I am Sargon, the powerful king, the king of Akkad. My mother was a priestess. I did not know my father. Okay, my mother conceived me, and in secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of reeds. She chalked its opening with bitumen. She cast me into the river, from which I could not rise. The river carried me off, brought me to Aki, the drawer of water. Aki, the drawer of water, brought me up as he dipped his basket. Aki, the drawer of water, raised me as a son. Notice how similar this story, okay, is from the story about Moses in Exodus 2. Okay, you have the same holy family, religious background, an unnamed father. I mean, there's weird similarities, right? Centrality of the mother, this kind of threat to the young ruler's life, thrown into the water, in an ark of some sort. Okay, the special background is not known by the person who picks him up and raises him. Okay, this pattern will become so familiar, right? That later it'll be mimicked in the New Testament, right? And Jesus will, of course, mimic the same pattern, or at least Jesus in one of the stories, in one of the Gospels, will mimic the kind of Moses story again, repeating the pattern anew, okay? The second thing to notice about Moses' introduction in Exodus 2 is how the introduction of this new holy kind of divine ruler, divinely kind of ordained ruler, is intertwined with hints that this is, again, a new creation myth, okay? Notice that the basket that the child Moses is placed in is really, the word basket is the same word as in Hebrew as the word for the ark, i.e. the ark in the Noah's story. Okay, and this basket or ark is described in the same way in both instances, that it's pitched with bitumen. Okay, hence the use of this same imagery of the ark kind of floating in the river, endangering, in a time of danger, right? It links the stories of Noah and Moses together, okay? Showing that, again, this is another story, or the beginning of another story of a divinely ordained savior of humankind, okay? Another origin myth about how the world, or in this case, a special people, will be threatened with chaos, symbolized by the waters of the river, and how they will, with God's help, overcome the water or overcome the chaos, especially with their chosen, ruler figure, and be saved. Okay. With Noah, remember, this was a kind of, the Noah narrative was a redoing of the creation myth of the whole world. Okay. With Moses, it is a creation account of now the people of Israel. Okay, so who is being created, slightly changes. Okay, and of course, like I said, Jesus will again follow the same pattern set up by Moses and Noah in a later repetition of this trope. Okay, and this is what happens next to the now miraculously preserved holy ruler savior guy, Moses. Okay, so this is in Exodus 2, verse 4 and following. We are told that his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river while her attendants walked beside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. And she named him Moses because she said, I drew him out, Masach, out of the water. Okay. We are told that Moses' sister, unnamed here, but later her name will be said to be Miriam. And we'll meet her later, said that Miriam watches Moses, okay, be picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, notice again the emphasis on Moses' royal background. Okay, and when she sees that Pharaoh's daughter has picked up her brother, Moses' sister cleverly goes, offers to get Moses' real mother to act as a wet nurse. Okay, notice the prominent role of Miriam here, the sister of Moses, right? Notice how she kind of saves him, connects him back into their family. Okay, many scholars, feminist scholars in particular, argue that that Miriam was a very important figure, whose stories in the biblical corpus was repressed. Okay, that she might have been an important religious figure, and when her kind of priests, I'll talk about this later, were kind of thrown out of power, the stories about her were either given a negative tint or sort of suppressed or silenced. Okay, now we are told here that Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, and that her mode of discovery leads to him being named Moses. Okay, that is, the baby is called Moses. Why? Because he was drawn out, or masach, out of the river. Okay, but again, like all etymologies in the biblical text, this is a false explanation, a false etymology of his name. Okay, for one, why would Pharaoh's daughter know Hebrew? Okay, and Masach is a Hebrew, okay, trilateral root. Okay, rather, if you look at Moses' name very carefully, and people have, Moses has a good Egyptian name, albeit a bit misshapen. Okay, the consonants MSS, Masach, Moses, again, it's consonantal, okay, is Egyptian, and it means to be born of or begotten of. And we see this, MSS repeated in a bunch of Egyptian names, such as Ramses, which means what? Begotten of Ra, a particular Egyptian deity. Or King Tut, Tutmosis, again, the same thing, right? Born of or begotten of Tut, another Egyptian deity. Okay, but notice how in these other names, the MSS, is preceded by a name of what? An Egyptian deity, Ra or Tut. Okay, as we have it, Moses' name is odd, right? Because it only has the born of part, but it doesn't have born of the deity in front of it. Okay. Likely we don't have Moses's complete name here. Okay, rather Moses's name probably, like Ramses or Tutmosis, had a good Egyptian god's name in front of it. Okay, but and this was fine. Until of course Moses becomes deeply associated with a group of people called the Israelites, and deeply associated with a deity named Yahweh. Okay, at which point likely the first part of Moses's name was dropped, and you only get Moses. Okay, and also the reason why you get this kind of false etymology. Okay, Uh, Indeed, not just Moses, but all the characters associated with the story of Exodus from Egypt, namely Aaron, Miriam, they all have Egyptian names, which is very interesting. And some do wonder whether this hints of a kind of historical core to the Exodus narrative, despite there being no archaeological evidence for the Exodus. Indeed, a mass movement of people from Egypt to Canaan would have left a whole bunch of debris. We don't find any of this debris, but there's some weird clues about whether there is something, again, not the way that it's described in the biblical text, but whether there is a kind of core to it that may be real. Okay. Indeed, in talking about a historical core, many people think that the story of Moses and the Exodus may refer to a group of people called the Hyksos, and I'll talk about them in a little later. The Hyksos were a group of West Asiatic, Semitic, people who gained control of Egypt in 1650 BCE. And the group's rule were later overturned by the Egyptians. Okay, and we do wonder, scholars do wonder whether this is really at the core of the Exodus narrative. Okay, and the Hyksos will, like I said, come up again. Okay, to see what happens next to Moses, turn to the next video.